Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Church of Grace. My name is Patrick Hayes, and today is Friday, November 1st, and we are in the book of Matthew, part 45, and we're going to be in Matthew chapter 21. We finished up Matthew chapter 20 last week, and we are going to, we're not going to finish Matthew chapter 21, but we're going to move through it. So tonight, we are going to look at one of the most important days in Earth's history. This is the day when Jesus arrives in Jerusalem to declare to the world that he is king. Jesus not only declares that he's king, but he also presents himself as Messiah. So the word Messiah is a Hebrew word, and that word means the chosen one or the anointed one. And that Hebrew word Messiah in the Greek, which we read in the New Testament, is Christ. So whenever you read Messiah in the Old Testament or Christ in the New Testament, it's the same word. It is talking about the chosen one. It's talking about God who's going to show up and who's been sent to take away the sins of the world. So let's read Matthew chapter 21. Let's read the first 7 verses if you got your Bible with you. Matthew chapter 21, starting in verse 1. And when they drew nigh unto Jerusalem and were come to Bethphage, I've also heard it pronounced Bethphage. So don't ask me how to pronounce half of the words in the Bible. I'm not that guy. What you got to do is you just got to get a good running start at the beginning of the word. You just get through it. So I'm going to say Beth. No, it just sounds weird. Bethphage? Okay. Yeah, you try it. Okay. And when they drew nigh unto Jerusalem and were come to Bethphage, onto the Mount of Olives, then sent Jesus 2 disciples, saying unto them, Go into the village over against you, and straightway ye shall find an ass tied, and a colt with her. Loose them and bring them unto me, and if any man say aught unto you, ye shall say, The Lord hath need of them, and straightway he will send them. All this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet, saying, Tell ye the daughter of Zion, Behold, thy king cometh unto thee, meek and sitting upon an ass, and a colt, the foal of an ass. And the disciples went and did as Jesus commanded them, and brought the ass and the colt, and put on them their clothes, and they set him thereon. Okay, so in verse 1, Jesus is approaching the city of Jerusalem from the east. Now, we're going to start out using some maps, and I just love a good map. Okay, so here, let's see. Okay, we're going to try this. So here's the Mount of Olives, and Jesus is going to enter this gate right here. That is the East Gate in Jerusalem. It is also called the Golden Gate. Now, this gate is important for several reasons. You go to present-day Israel, there are several roads that lead down to this area. On the map, you can see this one road that goes this way, and this road ends up going off to Bethany. You also find a road that comes up this way and meets here, and the town of Bethphage, I feel like that's going to be a problem the whole night. That town is right in here. So what I want you to understand is that when you go from the Mount of Olives, from Bethany to Bethphage, into Jerusalem, you are going downhill. Now, this is important. When you, and I'm going to go back here, this right here, and you can see Jerusalem. And that is this picture right here. And if you see this little guy right here, which kind of stands out, that is the Dome of the Rock. If you're not sure what the Dome of the Rock is a Muslim temple, or a Muslim, we'll call it a Muslim temple. I know they call them a mosque. It's not a mosque. It's a pagan temple to a pagan god. I'm going to call it a temple. So that is the Dome of the Rock. Now, the Dome of the Rock currently sits on the Temple Mount. That is where the temple that was in Jerusalem in the days of Jesus sat. And if you see, boy, this is tough. It is right here. That is the East Gate. And I believe I have another picture of it. Maybe not. There is the East Gate. That is the gate that Jesus entered into 2,000 years ago. East Gate. Does anyone notice anything strange about that East Gate? What's that? There's no gate. Very good. That gate has been sealed up. That gate no longer allows anyone to walk into it. So the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman in 1541 sealed up that gate. He did that, he is a Muslim, he did that because Messiah is coming back and is going to enter the East Gate, and he wanted to stop it. Along with that, what you'll notice, you know what, let's do one of these. That's terrible. What is this? Tombs. It's a cemetery. It's a Muslim cemetery. Anyone know why that was put in front of the East Gate? Yeah, because Jesus is Jewish. And he cannot enter in through a cemetery. That would make him ceremonially unclean. So again, the Muslims put a cemetery in front of the East Gate, hoping to stop Messiah from showing up. So guess what, folks? I don't care what your neighbor thinks. 1 billion Muslims know Jesus is Messiah. Any questions so far? Now, in this picture here, it's important that you notice when you come around the corner, either way, if you want to debate which way Jesus went, that's fine. We can have our opinions. When you come around the corner, the Mount of Olives is in front of you, blocking your view of Jerusalem. You come around a corner, and all of a sudden it opens up. You can see the whole city. That's very important. No matter which way you go, it's going to be pertinent halfway through this chapter or this lesson. So I just want you to see that is one of the views. You come around the corner, there it is. Jerusalem is in front of you, and as you can see, we are looking down on the city. Okay, verse 2. Jesus tells his disciples to go into town and bring the mother donkey and the colt. Does anyone know what a colt is? What's a colt? Well, it could be a baby, but more importantly, there's part of the definition of a cult. A cult is unbroken. So you know what a cult doesn't want? Anyone riding it. A colt is an unbroken donkey. This means that the young male donkey Jesus will ride into Jerusalem does not have people ride it. Verse 3. Very simply, if someone thinks you are stealing the donkeys, just tell them the Lord needs them. This doesn't happen in the account Matthew gives, but Jesus told them just in case. In verse 4, the prophet Zechariah wrote this prophecy, and he wrote this prophecy 400 years prior to Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. It's in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, and let's take a look at it. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding upon an ass, and upon a colt, the foal of an ass. This is your king. That's what it says. This is addressed to the folks in Jerusalem, get ready, your king is coming, and he's going to be riding a donkey. So the disciples obeyed, and in verse 7, they set their garments on the animals for Jesus to sit upon. Jesus sits on the colt to ride down the hill into Jerusalem. Now, how many times has a king made a triumphant entry into his capital city for the first time as king riding a donkey? I'm no student of history, but I imagine the number is small. I would imagine the king rides in on a chariot. There's probably a parade. There's probably a big, noble steed that the king rides in on with a lot of pomp and fanfare, and it's this big to-do. I doubt many kings ride into their capital city for the first time with 12 of their unemployed friends. But that's what Jesus does, riding a donkey. Probably not the entrance the Jews were expecting from their Messiah. Let's read verses 8 through 11. And a very great multitude spread their garments in the way. Others cut down branches from the trees and strawed them in the way. And the multitudes that went before and that followed cried, saying, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. And when he was come into Jerusalem, all the city was moved, saying, Who is this? And the multitude said, This is Jesus, the prophet of Nazareth of Galilee. All right, we're not going to get past these 3 verses for a minute. So in verse 8, who were these people? Verse 9 says there were multitudes. There were multitudes in front of them. There were multitudes behind them. Who were these people? Fans, okay? It's better than groupies. I don't think they were folks that showed up to see Jesus. Now, I might be wrong, but hear me out. Everyone traveling to Jerusalem, entering into the city by the east, was heading down this road. And how many people were going to Jerusalem for this week? Everybody. The whole country. Remember, we read that it was mandatory that every Jewish male, I believe it was 12 years old and up, was mandated to go to Jerusalem 3 times for the feast days. This is one of them, for Passover. So people from all over the country are coming into the city. We're going to go over numbers and give you an idea how many people were there a little later. But we are talking about hundreds of thousands of people swarmed into this city and the surrounding area at this time. I think these folks were just traveling to Jerusalem, entering the city from the eastern gate. I think these folks saw what was happening, and I think the Spirit moved them. I don't think anyone was really with Jesus other than his 12. Maybe there were some other disciples there, I don't know. The people cried, saying, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. What is that phrase, the Son of David? What does that mean? First of all, what is it? It's not a name. It's a title. Son of David is the title of Messiah. And the crowd was quoting from Psalm 118. They were quoting from Psalm 118, verses 24 to 26. And if you all play your cards right, you'll get to hear me sing in a minute. Psalm 118, that was not an appropriate place to laugh. It was probably correct. Psalm 118, 24 to 26. This is the day which the Lord hath made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. Save now, I beseech thee, O Lord. O Lord, I beseech thee, send now prosperity. Blessed be he that cometh in the name of the Lord. We have blessed you out of the house of the Lord. So that song, I'm going to go back to the verse that you've heard if you grew up in church or you have kids that go to church. This is the day that the Lord hath made. Anyone know that one? Okay, how's it go? This is the day that the Lord hath made. I will rejoice and be glad in it. Oh, you guys are terrible. All right. It's all right. You gave it a shot. I mean, there wasn't a lot of heart, but you went through the motions. Counts for something. So, see how I got you to sing? So, we sing that song as if when we're singing the song, today, the day that we are singing the song, is the day that the Lord made. Right? All the kids that are singing think, yeah, today's the day that the Lord made. We're going to rejoice and be glad in it. Do you know that it's not? Nope. Psalm 118 is not talking about today or tomorrow when the kids sing it. It's talking about this day when Jesus rides into town on a donkey. The psalmist wrote this talking about a day. We believe that King David wrote this psalm, and he wrote it, and it is prophetic. It's almost 1,000 years prior to Jesus riding in to Jerusalem on a donkey. But it is about this day. Do you know that this day is written about in many, many, many books of the Bible? It's talked about by many prophets. It's one of the most talked about individual days in the Bible, the day that Jesus shows up in Jerusalem. This day is special because God told us the exact day Messiah would ride into Jerusalem and declare himself to be king. God told the prophet Daniel by the archangel Gabriel 490 years earlier, technically 483. We're going to take a quick look at that prophecy because it will help you better understand Jesus' frame of mind and his emotional state when he rides into Jerusalem. We're going to get to that. So let's take a look at the 70 weeks of Daniel. We're going to go through this. We're going to go through it briefly. If you want this slide, I can email it to you later. Just let me know. We're going to start in the upper left. In 586 BC, that wasn't it. Let's try this again. In 586 BC, this is when Nebuchadnezzar destroys the city of Jerusalem and the temple, and all the Israelites are taken captive and taken away to Babylon, and they are in Babylon for a period of 70 years. Now, this is the third of 3 sieges. Nebuchadnezzar comes and lays siege, and the 3 sieges go over the course of about 20 years. Nebuchadnezzar starts in, I believe, 605 BC, lays siege to Jerusalem. He sets up a vassal king. So he sets up another Israelite king, but he says, okay, you guys report to me now. Y'all are Babylonians, but you can have your own king. And he takes away a bunch of captives. In that first group goes the prophet Daniel, who was a young man. We believe Daniel could have been as young as 17 when he was taken away to Babylon during the first siege. About 20 years later, the third siege happens. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, by this time, is done. He is tired of going back to Jerusalem and laying siege to this place. So he destroys the city, he destroys the temple, and he takes everybody captive with him, takes them away this third time in 586 BC. In 538 BC, Daniel receives a prophecy from the archangel Gabriel. And this is the prophecy that we're going to look at for a moment. In Daniel chapter 9, we're going to look at verses 24 and 25. Daniel chapter 9, verse 24. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now bear with me for a second and follow this. There is a period of time that is special, and that time period is 70 weeks. 70 weeks are determined. Now, normally, we think of a week as a period of 7 days. But in the Bible, this week is a group of 7. And in this case, it is used as weeks of years, groups of 7. So there are going to be 70 weeks of years. 70 times 7 years, or 490 years. That is going to be the amount of time that this prophecy is talking about. Verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. And we all know that those three numbers add up to be... It's like, wait, how many score in a gallon? Okay. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. So there is a period of time which is going to be 7 weeks and 60. A score is 20. Okay, so 27 weeks, 67 weeks plus 2 weeks is 69 weeks. So in this 70-week prophecy, okay, we are using up 69 of these weeks. Now, the Bible tells us here that there are 2 dates. It starts from the going forth of the commandment to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. That's event number 1. Unto the Messiah the Prince. That means Messiah declaring himself now understand, you and I use prince as if we think of a kid who's the son of a king waiting to be king. Okay, here when we talk about prince, this also counted as the ruler of the land. Okay, we would use it synonymously as we would use the word king. So from the commandment to go and restore and rebuild Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince will be 69 weeks of years. So here we have March 14th, 445 BC. Artaxerxes Longimanus, the Persian king, gives the commandment for the Jews to go back to their homeland and rebuild Jerusalem, and then they rebuild the temple and they rebuild the wall. We read about these, and this specific commandment happens in Nehemiah chapter 2, and then we read about the commandments in Ezra as well. So the Jews go back to their homeland, they rebuild the city, they rebuild the temple. So that's the second temple that's going to be built. That's the temple that is standing in Jerusalem when Jesus arrives, when Jesus is born. It's the second temple. That date was March 14th, 445 BC. Jesus arrives in Jerusalem on April 6th, 32 AD. That is the day we're talking about in Matthew chapter 21. If you take 69 weeks of years, that ends up being 483 years. If you take 483 years and multiply it by the number of days in a year, 360. Now I know what you're saying. Patrick, your math isn't right. Well, let me tell you, folks, okay, there are 3 types of people in the world. There are people who are good at math, and there are people who aren't. You know, when you have to explain a joke, it's just not funny. Okay. 360 days is the number of days in a year in the Bible calendar. The calendar that God gave to the nation of Israel, there are 12 30-day months totaling 360 days, not 365 like we use in the Gregorian calendar. So 483 years times 360 days equals 173,880 days, and that includes all of the leap years. Now, in between March 14th, 445 BC, and April 6th, 32 AD, was exactly 173,880 days. Daniel was given that prophecy almost 500 years before Jesus showed up. And in the book of Daniel, Daniel even says, God, I don't know what to do with this prophecy. God says, don't worry about it. Just write it down, put it on the shelf. It's not for you. What this means is that everyone living in Israel who, number one, had the scriptures, and number two, had a third grade understanding of math, they could have figured out the exact day Messiah would show up and declare that he was king. It was there for everybody. Any questions so far? And if you don't believe me, go ahead, just put it in Google. Google, how many days in between March 14th, 445 BC and April 6th, 32 AD? It'll tell you 173,880 days. Because God forbid we know anything that we don't learn on Google. Now, there's a lot more prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, but we're not going to go over it right now. We are going to go over it later in the book of Matthew, but we're not going to do it now. My point is that the day Jesus showed up in Jerusalem was foretold. It was a specific day. It was given to us centuries ago. Anyone could have figured it out. But we knew the exact day he was going to show up. With that in mind, let's read about the same account given in the Gospel of Luke. Now, I got these verses up here on the slide. Luke chapter 19, we're going to look at verses 35 to 44. This is the same story about Jesus coming into Jerusalem on a donkey, told by the author Luke. And they brought him to Jesus, and they cast their garments upon the colt, and they sat Jesus thereon. And as he went, they spread their clothes in the way. And when he was come nigh, even now, at the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works that they had seen, saying, Blessed be the King that cometh in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest. This is them quoting Psalm 118 again. And some of the Pharisees among the multitude said unto him, Master, rebuke thy disciples. And he answered and said unto them, I tell you that if these should hold their peace, the stones would cry out. Any questions so far? We're reading the exact same account with a few extra details that Matthew has omitted. Yes, question in the back. What would the stones cry out? They would have cried out that the Messiah is coming. Messiah is here. I think they would have quoted Psalm 118. If you ever get to go to Jerusalem, go up to the Mount of Olives and walk on down to Jerusalem and just grab any old rock. That rock was one of the rocks that did not cry out. Okay, let's look at what happens next. Verse 41, and when he was come near, he beheld the city, and he wept over it. Jesus came around the corner, he saw the city, and he wept. Why did Jesus weep over Jerusalem? We find the answer in the next verse. saying, If thou hadst known, even thou, at least in this thy day, the things which belong unto thy peace, but now they are hid from thine eyes. In this thy day, what is Jesus talking about? What day is he referring to? It is the day that Daniel said Messiah would arrive. All the learned scholars in Israel, not one Pharisee, not one Sadducee, not one scribe, was there waiting for Messiah to show up. Jesus wept because when he came around the bend and could see the city of Jerusalem below, no one was there waiting for him. The entire country should have been celebrating that Messiah has arrived. They should have received Jesus as their king, but no one was there, and Jerusalem would pay a price. Verse 43. For the days shall come upon thee that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee round, and keep thee in on every side. This is talking about 70 A.D. General Titus Vespasian laid siege to Jerusalem with 4 Roman legions. Millions of men, women, and children were slaughtered. Verse 44, and shall lay thee even with the ground, and thy children within thee, and they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another, because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation. Why did it happen? Why did the destruction of Jerusalem and the great dispersion of the Jews around the world happen? Because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation. I told you the day. I gave you the exact day, and not one of you showed up to welcome me as your king. So Jerusalem was destroyed. Any questions? The nation of Israel started the rejection of the Messiah in Matthew chapters 10, 11, and 12. They continued it again here in Matthew chapter 21, and they will finally seal their fate in the court of Pontius Pilate when they reject Christ for the last time in Matthew chapter 27. Verse 10, everyone in the country has been hearing about this man Jesus. It's been so long, let me read it again. And when he was come into Jerusalem, all the city was moved, saying, Who is this? And the multitude said, This is Jesus, the prophet of Nazareth of Galilee. You know that word moved in verse 10 is relating to the shaking of an earthquake. It's something that everybody can feel. You ever been in an earthquake? Okay, let me tell you, it is unsettling. You feel uncomfortable real fast. Mild or severe, you know something's wrong. Everybody does. There's nobody that misses it. Nobody sleeps through it. Everyone in the city could feel it. Verse 11. I believe that all the people in the country believed that Jesus was a prophet. They'd all heard the stories. Jesus was not shy about showing his power, proving through miracles that he had the power of God upon him. This was special. Why was a prophet in Israel special? Joseph? Because there hadn't been any for 400 years. Since the great Italian prophet Malachi, who closes up the Old Testament, there has not been a prophet in Israel for 400 years. And now, in the lifetime of these people, a prophet has arrived, and a prophet with power. You got to remember, there were lots of prophets that would come into town and tell you what for. But not every prophet was the kind that was performing miracles. But this one taught with authority. This one performed the miracles of Elijah. This one was amazing, and everybody in the country knew who he was at this point. And they all knew Passover's coming, and when we go to Jerusalem, this guy's going to be there. We're going to get to hear him teach. We're going to get to see him. And these are events that only have happened in stories from generations ago, and we're going to get to see it. This was an amazing time if you lived in Israel. Do you know that we live in an amazing time today? What was the last prophecy we were all waiting for to have come true before Messiah returns? Okay? The nation of Israel comes back to the land and becomes a nation. Do you know that that was prophesied back in the book of Isaiah? Now, I'm in the weeds here, so just bear with me. I'm not going to get out of timeline. The one captivity where the nation of Israel was taken away from Jerusalem and taken away from Israel was in 586 when Babylon came. Do you know that before the Babylonians came, the prophet Isaiah said by God that when you are cast out from Israel, from the land of Canaan, from Jerusalem, because of your wickedness and idolatry, I will bring you back from all over the world a second time. Everyone in Israel said, a second time? We haven't even left a first time. And when they did leave, 70 years later, did God gather the nation of Israel from all over the world and bring them back to Jerusalem? No, he did not. He brought them all back from Babylon. The prophecy that the Jews would be scattered throughout the whole world was given centuries before they even left their nation for the first time. So we knew that they were going to be gathered back and brought back to Israel, brought back to Jerusalem as their capital city as a nation. Do you know that if you read Bible commentaries prior to 1948, the preachers in the commentaries would talk about that prophecy and say it had to be analogous? There is no way that the nation of Israel could be a nation again with Jerusalem as their capital. It's impossible. The Jews live in every country on earth. They just went through the Holocaust. And in under 10 years, God brings them back to Canaan land, sets them up as a nation again, and every single Bible scholar says, hold on a minute. I was wrong. Nobody thought they would become a nation again. It was impossible. It had never happened in the history of the world. And then a dead language called Hebrew was revived in that nation. Also prophesied, also never happened in the history of the world. I don't know where I am here. Okay. Let's read verses 12 to 16. I feel like there was supposed to be a point at the end of that. All right, it's a good place to go. We'll just leave it. Yes, what do we got? Okay, very good. Thank you. Bring it on home. Stay out of my preaching. It's a good time to live because for centuries and centuries, if you go, I can show you every 100 years there was a Christian who was writing saying the Lord is returning in my lifetime. Looking back, we can say, nope. But he can come back now. What is going to happen, possibly, in our lifetime. By the way, at the end of this, there's going to be a QR code on the screen. You scan that. You can mortgage your house right over to the church. We'll take it from you because you ain't going to need it because Jesus is coming back. Okay, so we've planned this out. We're not just shooting from the hip here. No, I'm joking. No, that's funny because there are churches that have done that. I mean, it's not funny. It's terribly sad how stupid their people were to follow such an idiot. But either way, here we are. We can, is it too soon? The Lord can come back any day, and what's coming is going to be very exciting. And we're going to be talking about this. When we get to Matthew chapter 24, it's going to take us 3 weeks to get through that one chapter, at least. Okay. Let's read verses 12 to 16. We're going to get through these, and we'll be done, and then we can get some more ice cream. The ice cream's melting. This is a good time to get the ice cream. It's nice and soft. Can we just have a quick straw poll here? Just a quick poll, okay? Means nothing. It's not scientific, and I'm not trying to make a point against my wife. Let's just say that, okay? Who here thinks it would be a good idea if there were a button on the microwave labeled ice cream for the appropriate amount of time to warm up the ice cream so you can eat it? Got 3, 4, 5, 6. Get out of my church. All 6 of you. It's on video. All right, let's read chapter 21, verses 12 to 16. You're like, you know what? I'd use that. Verse 12. Oh boy, I'm in Matthew 12. Here we go, 21. And Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all them that sold and bought in the temple and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves, and said unto them, It is written, My house shall be called the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. And when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying in the temple, and saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were sore displeased. See, babies cried back then in the temple too. It's totally fine. And said unto him, Hearest thou what these say? And Jesus saith unto them, Yea, have ye never read, out of the mouth of babes and sucklings thou hast perfected praise. Okay, that's as far as we're going to go, but we're going to get through these verses. Okay, verse 12, what is this talking about? So here are the facts. Number 1, Jesus kicked out of the temple those who bought and sold. Number 2, he overthrew the tables of the money changers. Number 3, he overthrew the seats of those who sold doves. Now, there is a different event that is very similar that we read about in the Gospel of John, chapter 2. That's in the beginning of his ministry about 3 years ago. That's when he fashions himself a whip, and he does some of the same stuff. So, let me give you some background and explain what this is all about, because there's a lot of confusion about these verses. In the Bible, we find the Levitical priesthood that worked in the temple. Oftentimes were very devout men, very much loved God, obeyed God, and were very serious about obeying God. Other times, they were idol-worshiping pagans who oppressed the poor, robbed the people, and corrupted the priesthood. And we find both of those throughout the Bible. There's a fella who was a high priest that goes by the name of Annas, A-N-N-A-S. This fellow was equal to the head of a mafia crime family. The office of the high priest was similar to politics in our nation's capital today. Politics, it's made up of two words, poly, meaning many, and ticks, meaning blood-sucking. The office of the high priest was bought and sold in the days of Jesus. The Roman governors of Jerusalem appointed the high priest, and Annas was the high priest from 6 to 15 AD. 5 of his sons, 1 of his grandsons, and 1 of his son-in-laws all ended up serving as a high priest. The historian Josephus said he was a great hoarder up of money. Now, one of the requirements for temple worship was animal sacrifice. You would bring animals to the temple, you'd give it over to the priest would ask you what type of sacrifice it was for, and then they would do a certain type of sacrifice, cut up the animal a certain way, do their thing. Those sacrifices needed to be inspected by the Levitical priests. If the animal you brought didn't pass their inspection, you had to buy one of theirs. Along with that, if you were not an agricultural family, so you didn't raise livestock, you weren't a herdsman, you didn't have sheep and goats and whatnot, and maybe you lived a little further away from Jerusalem, so when you came to offer sacrifices at the temple, it was kind of a big to-do. You had to travel. You're not going to buy a sheep or a goat or a whatever and bring it with you. You're just going to buy an animal when you get to Jerusalem for the sacrifice. Well, if the animal you brought didn't pass their inspection, you had to buy one of theirs, and their animals were very, very expensive. We believe Annas and his sons had a monopoly on the stalls in the temple. And on the Mount of Olives, they were called the booths of the sons of Annas, where they sold all the things you needed for your sacrifice in the temple: the sheep, the wine, the oil, everything. They sold all of these things for outrageous prices. And they had a monopoly because they bribed people to get it. They also only accepted temple currency. So to go there and buy things, you had to take your Roman coins and go to the money changers and exchange them for temple currency, and there was a hefty fee put on that. This made it difficult for many people to worship God, and it made it impossible for poor people to participate in the temple worship. Now follow me. The historian Josephus tells us that, does everyone know who Josephus is? Josephus was hired by the Roman government to be a historian for the Jews. He has one of the most exhaustive accounts. I believe his works were published within a few years after the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. It's one of the oldest and most reliable historical records we have that's extra biblical on the Bible times. Before the Gospels were all written, his work was done. The historian Josephus tells us that on Passover in 65 AD, there were 256,000 Passover lambs that were slaughtered. Do you guys know that the Levitical priests who butchered and prepped these animals on Passover were so skilled at their trade that people would come from around the world just to watch them butcher these animals. 256,000 Passover lambs, that means there was roughly 2.5 to 3 million people in the city of Jerusalem in 65 AD. Annas and his family made a fortune every feast day when millions of people would come to Jerusalem and they all needed to buy their stuff. This is why we read the following in Mark chapter 11, verses 17 and 18. And he taught, saying unto them, Is it not written, My house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. So this is the same account we just read in Matthew, but we're getting it from the author Mark. And the scribes and the chief priests heard it and sought how they might destroy him. For they feared him, because all the people was astonished at his doctrine. They wanted to kill Jesus when his actions affected their wallet. He flipped over the money changers' tables and the seats and the tables of the people that sold all the stuff in the temple. Money went flying everywhere. All their stuff was everywhere. It was a massive commotion. They lost how many days' worth of commerce? It was a mess. And they wanted him dead. Any questions? Yes, sir. Yes.
How big is that area?
How big is Jerusalem?
Yeah, it's not that big.
No, Israel is smaller than the state of New Jersey.
3 million people, the city. I'm just thinking logistically, that's...
It was insane. Now, people didn't just live in Jerusalem. Okay, you ready for this? Let's get in the weeds. Where did people live during the time of the feast days when they would come to the capital city? They'd live in tents. How far away would they live? Would they live, say, 16 miles to the south in a small town called Bethlehem? Did you know that's what was going on when Jesus was born in Bethlehem? Did you know why there were no rooms at the inn? Yeah, because of how busy it was, because everyone from the whole country came down. It was a time of a feast day. So technically, you could stay within what was called a Sabbath day's journey. So if we were to go back to this picture. So what we said was Bethphage was here. Oh, sorry, that's not on. Okay, and Bethany, the road to Bethany, was this way. Bethphage, or no, I'm sorry, I believe, oh boy, now I'm thinking of it. It's either Bethphage or Bethany. They're two different towns. I'm not sure which one. It had to be Bethany, was the furthest point that was considered a Sabbath day's journey. So you understand, bear with me. On the Sabbath day, you could travel, but you could only travel so far. Which means if you went to Jerusalem for the feast days, some of those feast days were Sabbath days where you weren't allowed to work or travel or do any stuff. But the city, which was packed, meant everyone had to stay in the suburbs, and a lot of people did camp out. The furthest place you could go where you could still legally travel to Jerusalem for the feast day on a Sabbath was, I believe, Bethany. Or to the south, Bethlehem. So people stayed in a lot of the surrounding areas, and they went into Jerusalem for the festivities. Some people, I don't think, really even went into Jerusalem. It was packed, and everyone's like, yeah, it's good enough. Okay, but they would stay in the surrounding areas. That, to answer your question, how did they all squeeze in there? Yeah, okay. It's a good question. Any others? We're almost done. Let's see where we are. Okay, verse 13. You can see why Jesus is upset. Jesus is quoting here from Isaiah 56:7 and Jeremiah 7:11 about his house, which is supposed to be a house of prayer, turned into a den of thieves. In verse 14, as usual, those in need came to Jesus and he healed them. Right after Jesus makes enemies out of the most powerful Jewish family in the country, he reminds everyone of who he is and what power he possesses. The blind and the deaf and the lame show up and he heals them all. This is also a great reminder of who Jesus is and why he is there. In Luke 4:18 and 19, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. Jesus was sent to do many things. One of them was to give sight to the blind, and he seemed to do that often. Last two verses, verse 15. Everyone got to witness who Jesus was. Even the children were calling him Messiah. Now, at his enemies, this time from Psalm chapter 8, verse 2. Now, one last thing that I thought was kind of neat in this verse is that the children get it. The college-educated church leaders do not get it. Scribes and the Pharisees didn't get it. Kids got it. That is Messiah. Okay, and that concludes our lesson on Matthew chapter 21. Next week, we're going to finish up Matthew 21, or we're going to give it our dead level best. And we're going to go from there. Any questions before we close on a word of prayer? Did anyone do the homework? Does anyone want to see the answer to the homework? You did the What's that? Yes, so you had two pieces of homework. Number one, Jesus said to his disciples in chapter 20, okay, can you drink of the cup that I'm going to drink of? Can you be baptized with the baptism I am going to be baptized with? Then he defines what the cup is. What was the cup he was going to drink of? Crucifixion. But Jesus said, I am going to be baptized with a baptism. That is future tense. My question to you is, what was that baptism? Do you have a guess? Okay, very good. A lot of people go with the resurrection, okay? And I think that's a fine answer, and that might be a totally correct answer. It's not the answer I give. Jesus has two titles. Jesus came from what tribe? Mac? David's not a tribe. Judah, very good. And he also came from Levi. Very good. Who comes from the tribe of Judah? All of the kings. Who comes from the tribe of Levi? All of the priests. Jesus has two titles. He has many titles, but two of them are he is going to be our king and our high priest. Only guy, not the only guy, there's three characters in the Bible that are kings and priests. Jesus is one. Melchizedek is two. Anyone know who the third one is? It's you if you're born again. You're a king and a priest. We read about that in the New Testament. Now, Jesus is going to be our high priest. That's interesting because what we find is in the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Christ, when he comes back down to earth, sets up his earthly kingdom, he's going to rule and reign from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. The temple will be rebuilt. That'll be the fourth temple. First temple was built by Solomon, destroyed in 586 BC by Nebuchadnezzar. Second temple was built in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, went all the way up through 70 AD when the Romans destroyed it. There is no temple today. We are waiting for the third temple that will be built. By the way, it's got to be built on the site of the Dome of the Rock, so that thing's got to go. You ain't going to see me crying when it happens. That temple has to be there for the 70th week of Daniel, because the Antichrist stands up in the temple in Jerusalem. Got to be a temple for him to stand up in it. Then we find out in the millennium is the fourth temple, described by the prophet Ezekiel, very different from the first three temples. And that temple, guess what is going to happen? The feast days will be celebrated, and who will be our high priest? Jesus. And what does the high priest need to do before he does his priestly duties? He needs to get in the laver, needs to dunk himself under the water and ceremonially become clean. Now you say, why does Jesus need to do that? He doesn't have any sin. Why did he need to be baptized? Okay, he didn't get saved. Okay, he was showing us what to do. Okay, so Jesus, as our high priest in the millennium, will get dunked at least once a week as our high priest. Okay, so that's my answer. I don't know if it's right, but I do know all those things are going to happen. There is a fourth temple. Jesus is our high priest, and the feast days will happen, and we will celebrate them. Okay, very good. Second bit of homework. Does anyone remember what it was? Had to do with 2 verses. Okay, let's take a quick look. I'm going to give it to you. If you guys are dying to get out of here, go get your kids or go get ice cream or whatever you got to do. Are the kids, am I going to get in trouble because the ladies are over there with the kids? Okay, it's going to be 2 minutes. This is honestly faster. We're getting out of here earlier than we almost ever do, even though we're 10 minutes late. So this is pretty good. Okay, here's what I want you to do. You're going to go to Luke chapter 4. Put your finger there. Luke chapter 4. Then go to Isaiah chapter 61. Put your finger there. This is going to make you the smartest Christian in every room that you walk into this Thanksgiving. You can show off to all your friends. Okay. What happens, I'm going to put one of these little ribbons in here so I can find it. What happens in Luke chapter 4 is Jesus is traveling and he shows up in a synagogue on the Sabbath day. Now, the custom was that in every synagogue in Israel, they would go through a scheduled reading of the Old Testament. So no matter what synagogue you went to, on this Saturday, we read this portion of the scripture, then the next one we read this. So if you were on vacation visiting your family, you knew what scripture was going to be taught in the synagogue in that town, just like in your town. Everyone follow me? They're all on a schedule. When a visitor showed up in a synagogue, it was customary to say to that individual, would you be so kind as to come up and read from the scripture today and expound on it? We would like to hear your thoughts. So if you were a husband or a man over a certain age, there was always a chance that you might be asked, hey, would you come up and expound on the scriptures as the visitor? It was just a kind gesture. Jesus shows up on the day that Isaiah chapter 61 was going to be read. And he reads it in Luke chapter 4 in verses 18 and 19. Here we go. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. You see how this is neat? Because the scripture was prophesying about him and he's reading it about himself. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath appointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. What's next? After the word Lord. Period. Now let's go to Isaiah chapter 61. In Isaiah chapter 61, starting in verse 1, The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, comma, and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all that mourn. Why did Jesus stop reading Isaiah 61 at a comma? Joseph. The second portion is his second coming. He did not show up to declare vengeance, the day of vengeance of our God. That's why Jesus stops reading Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 and 2 at a comma. Because in the Old Testament, the portions of prophecy predicting Messiah's first coming and his second coming are all together, which is why so many rabbis believed that there were two Messiahs, because they couldn't wrap their head around this idea that Messiah would be a lamb who is sacrificed and a king who rules. And they thought there were two different Messiahs. They never reconciled that, but we can, because we look back and we see it was a first coming and a second coming. Mason.
So does Jesus fulfill his own prophecy or that principle where he says the meek shall inherit the earth, because he comes as a lamb and then he's coming back as a king to inherit the earth?
I don't know.
So,
It's a good question. I'd want to think that through. I'm not sure. Possibly. Okay, we're going to have good job with the homework. I got no homework for you tonight. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll get out of here. Jesse, new father times 2. Go ahead and lead us in a word of prayer. Close us out, buddy.